Hi, folks. Another Tuesday evening, back again. These come around really quick. I want to recount. Put the pre-show on for a second. Nice to see everybody in there and some of the discussions, which we're going to pick up with Leith. He's teed up ready to come in just a moment. For those who haven't seen the setup here, this is the studio. Everything's pretty much running. I've got Leith in there in the box ready to come out shortly. And we've got the super chat and the various other bits and pieces, the multi-view and the bits and pieces there. So everything's working well tonight. I did have a slight problem when I first turned everything on. But there you go. As with these complicated systems, occasionally things go wrong. Of course, the dogs are here as well. And, one of the big dogs. So Luna's taking more than her fair share. Meteors, as you can see there, if I move the camera slightly, you can see there she's down there. But I can't move the camera further because otherwise you won't see much else. Anyway, so the dogs are here and hopefully they'll be a little bit quiet. And we've hit the 8 o'clock mark. So let me take the pre-show off and I'll be back after the start of show. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 22nd of July 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Thanks for taking some of your time on Tuesday evening. And we're going to have a really important deep dive economic conversation with Leith today. This is something which is really, really important, I think, to think about in the current environment. I should just make the point that we're going to talk in general terms. We don't provide specific financial advice or legal advice or property advice. It's a general conversation only, but feel free to throw your questions and comments into the chat. And specifically, if you'd like a question answered, if you use that Walk the World in the chat, that'll pick it up in my queue and make sure that I see it. And the point about that is that there's a lot of conversations that go on that we won't necessarily follow everything, but if you use @Walk the World, then I will see it. Also, I've enabled Super Chat, which means that if you want to get your question top of the list, you can do that. Or indeed, make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate those who do that. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there's a really important conversation to be had. So with that done, let me bring Leith straight in. Hi, Leith. Nice to see you again. How are you doing?
Good, thanks, Martin. How about yourself?
Yeah, I'm pretty good, thank you. We had quite a warm few weeks here. The weather has been remarkably warm, blue skies for a change, so it's been quite pleasant. But the school holidays have just started. Of course, it's going to go terribly wrong now.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I actually just got back from my first overseas trip for over 13 years. Went to Japan for 2 weeks. And they just happened to, as I arrived, they just happened to have their worst heat wave in 10 years. So we're talking high 30s with high humidity. But there was a silver lining. I did go to Disney World and Disney Sea in Tokyo, and because it was so hot, it was actually fairly empty, and I got to do all the rides without lighting up very much. That was good. But my kids unfortunately almost got a dose of heat stroke, especially down in Osaka and Kyoto, where I think one day it was 41 degrees with super high humidity. I think the real feel when I looked at it was like 46 degrees. So It was a very, very hot holiday, but I'm back in cold Melbourne now. So, pick your poison.
Well, I did a lot of work in Asia when I was running the consulting business, and Hong Kong, Korea, Japan in the summer. The humidity is just incredible. It's much higher even than Australia. I thought Australia was bad, but Asia was pretty amazing. And I remember being in Hong Kong in an absolute heat wave, and then we had one of those big storms come through, and we had massive... just crazy. Anyway, so relatively speaking, it's a little benign, isn't it, in Australia and also in the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially down here in Melbourne. I mean, Australia more generally, we don't get snow unless you're up in in our hills. I don't even call them mountains; they're really hills. We don't get snow at sea level really. We obviously have a bit more extreme weather up far north, but it's pretty. It's a bit of a Goldilocks climate down in Australia comparatively.
Absolutely. Well, that is very true. And interestingly, here, of course, we've had 6 weeks of no rain, and now everybody's talking about we haven't got any water. We've got to actually ration hose pipes, and the water bills are going to double in the next 5 years or something. I've always believed that cost of water is going to go through the roof. Now, let's talk about some of the critical things we want to discuss tonight. I think what we'd like to do is let's start by just talking about the RBA interest rates and property. I called this, pop goes the property weasel, because actually, if you look at all the data, and this particular slide came from Shane Oliver over at AMP, that said that quite often, once you see RBA rate cuts, property prices start rising. Now, I'm sure you've got some data that you can share on that too, Leith. So it is quite an interesting observation that we are in a rate cutting cycle. And the notes that came out from the minutes of the meeting suggested that they were a little bit shaky last month about rate cuts. Surprised everybody, but ahead, probably rate cuts. I think it's also just intriguing and a little worrying to also recall that the ABS has cut one of their critical surveys, right? The Income and Wealth Australia and the Housing Occupancy and Cost Survey. But why? Because they can't trust the data. And I guess my question is, well, how much other data shouldn't we trust from the ABS? So do we have a compass? Do we not have a compass? What's the RBA doing? And more particularly, what does it mean for property prices?
Yeah, look. Obviously, the last monetary policy meeting at the end of last month was, pretty interesting. So the financial markets had basically ascribed almost 100% probability, and pretty much every economist, and maybe there's one outlier, but just about every economist in the country and the financial markets ascribed a near certainty that the Reserve Bank was going to cut rates at its last meeting. And obviously, it was a hotly contested decision, but they voted 6-3, the board members, to keep rates on hold. And that was obviously a bit of a shock to the markets and everyone else and the media, etc. I was actually in Japan at the time, but so I was reading about it from afar. But the RBA's minutes were released today, and what they basically said was that the Reserve Bank erred on the side of caution because they didn't want to do four rate cuts in a row, because that would signal that it's not a gradual glide downwards. But they also said they're awaiting two key pieces of data, and one was the labour force data, and the other one's the Q2 CPI data. Now, last week we got the labour force data, and it was pretty bad. So we saw the unemployment rate jump by 0.2% to 4.3%. Now, obviously, that's still low historically, but it was actually 4.31%. But the thing about it was the actual internals were pretty bad. So there was a big loss of full-time jobs. So all the jobs that were created were part-time, and barely any jobs were created. We've still got the labour market growing fairly strongly because of high immigration. Hours worked dropped. The underemployment rate rose. The unemployment rate of 4.31% is now above what the RBA had forecast in the latest statement, their May statement of monetary policy, as the peak. So they picked a peak of 4.3% for unemployment in this cycle, so months away, and we're already at 4.31. So basically, the labour market data was very weak. And Roy Morgan's alternative survey, Roy Morgan also does a labour force survey. It's measured differently. Roy Morgan's survey effectively says anybody that wants a job that doesn't have a job is considered unemployed. That's effectively what they say. And Roy Morgan's survey has jumped in recent months, has spiked. It's gone up a lot, and it's sort of broken away from the ABS survey. But what it has signaled is that the labour market's weaker than what the official data suggests. And I think the latest June labour market report from the RBA is just basically a little bit of catch up of that. Now, it's also worth pointing out that the primary reason why Australia's unemployment rate is so low and we've had this strong jobs growth is because we've had a massive surge in government-funded jobs. So the labour market's divided into two sectors. We've got the market sector, which is effectively the private sector, and the non-market sector, which is basically can include public service jobs, but also jobs in private companies that are effectively funded by taxpayers. So if you think about, say, a private NDIS provider whose money comes from the government effectively through the NDIS, they're in the non-market sector. And the striking thing about this is since the pandemic, 60% of Australia's job growth has been the non-market sector. And the last 2 years, 80% of Australia's jobs growth has been in the non-market sector. So effectively, we've had this artificial job market whereby this record surge in the NDIS, which has now topped about $50 billion, has driven this massive rise in carer jobs and all that sort of thing. And then that's kept the unemployment rate artificially low. It's given us this labour market miracle, but it's really a fake miracle. And the private sector, which should be driving jobs, is actually very weak. And we've seen that with household consumption spending, which is actually, once you adjust for, population, has been negative for several years. Real per capita GDP, once you adjust for population growth, per capita GDP obviously does adjust for population growth. That's been negative for 9 and 11 quarters. So, the Australian economy is the structurally incredibly weak. The private sector is effectively in recession. We've seen that with, massive rise in insolvencies and that sort of thing. But it's been propped up by this by near record government spending, which in the March quarter was slightly below the December quarter's all-time high. And so it is a real artificial labour market. And what the RBA said in its minutes is that it's hoping, I should say, that the market sector, the private sector, takes over from the non-market sector and starts creating jobs and driving growth. But there's a real risk that it won't happen. And if it doesn't happen, we could see a very big rise in unemployment in the period ahead, which obviously means lower interest rates. So, what does this mean for interest rates? Well, obviously, with the weak labour market report, it pretty much guarantees that the Reserve Bank is going to cut interest rates at the August meeting. The only thing that could possibly stop it, and I say that's very, very unlikely, is if we get a spike in the QT CPI, which comes out, I think, later this month. So that would have to be a very big rise to stop them from cutting. But I think that's very unlikely because all the partial measures, whether that's the Westpac Melbourne Institute inflation gauge, the monthly inflation gauge, which isn't as reliable as the quarterly, but they're all pointing downwards. And all the capacity indicators, etc., from the NAB business survey and that sort of thing, they're all pointing to lower inflation. So I think you can pretty much lock in a rate cut in August. And the financial markets, have got a chart here, basically says, according to the latest financial market forecast, they still tip in we're going to have 3 more rate cuts over the next 12 months. So before the RBA held rates, it was 3 rate cuts by December. Now they've sort of pushed that out a bit. So 3 rate cuts within 12 months. And as the chart on the right shows, I showed this last time, this is from the AFR, a bit like Shane Oliver's data you just posted, suggests that the AFR measured the rise in house prices over previous rate cutting cycles. And what it showed is that typically after the beginning of rate cut cycle, home prices rise by, at least 10%, 24 months later. So I think we can be pretty confident that the housing market's going to, experience upward price pressure, should I say, from these rate cuts. But also, Martin, as I mentioned last time, we've also got massive oodles of stimulus coming from government policy. So, over the election campaign, I mentioned this last time, but Labor announced a 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers. So effectively, they're going to leverage the taxpayer to guarantee 15% of all first home buyer mortgages, or effectively all first home buyer mortgages. There are some caps, but they kick in at such a high rate, it's almost, that's going to capture almost everyone. And that'll be effective from 1 January 2026. That's the planned start date. So that's the start of next year. That'll just give more upward stimulus. The government has excluded student debts from loan serviceability calculations. They've expanded their shared equity scheme, which is called Help to Buy. We've seen some state government policies to also pump house prices. So, for example, the latest Queensland budget announced a very, very generous shared equity scheme as well, which has ridiculously generous qualification criteria. So another demand side scheme. We've also seen lenders announce new stimulatory mortgages. So 40-year mortgage terms, some of them have come out with that. We saw AMP release a 10-year interest-only mortgage without requiring any reassessment for investors, first home buyers, other owner occupiers, etc., effectively everyone. So once you factor all this stuff into account, you factor in falling interest rates, this demand side stimulus that is just, massive, as well as, which I'm sure we'll touch on later, it looks like we've got rebounding net overseas migration as well. Like it looked like it was coming down at the end of last year. It looks like it's spiking again. That pretty much points to one thing for property. And I think that just means, again, higher house prices and probably, and more household debt, which is, of course, exactly what the country does not need when we've already got a housing market that is so overinflated, it is ridiculous. So the latest chart pack from CoreLogic for June, Cotality is their new name, but formerly CoreLogic, they released their chart pack last week, and that showed that Australia's total housing stock now is valued at $11.5 trillion, spread out over 11.3 million homes, right? So that means that the average value now of every home in Australia, so that's including if you live in Sydney or you live in the the back end of Burke, middle of nowhere, in a house or apartment, a bedsit, whatever. The average now for dwellings in Australia is now about $1,018,000. So we have one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. We've obviously got one of the highest household debt loads in the world. And, the federal government, the state government, the Reserve Bank through interest rate cuts and lenders, of course, with these, mortgages designed to increase borrowing capacity and how much people borrow, is just going to pour more fuel on the housing bonfire and is likely just to push Australian housing into even more ludicrous nosebleed levels. It's very unfortunate.
Well, as I said, pop goes the weasel, Interestingly, if you look at the data from Shane as well, he's got percentage overvaluation relative to long-term price and rent ratios. And he's showing that houses in Sydney are 41% over their long-term trend, which is leading the way. Brisbane, 38%, Adelaide, 32%, Canberra, 34%, capital city average, 30%. But he says that units are a bit more variable. So in Perth and in Melbourne, it's not quite up there relative to Brisbane and Adelaide, where they were quite a lot stronger, and Hobart, where they're at 27% over as well for houses. So, whichever way you look at it, all the data points the same way, that housing is less affordable than it ever was. If you compare incomes to prices, if you compare the multiple of incomes now, so, in the old days, you could get on one income. Now it's always two incomes or even more incomes. I use that in my modeling quite a lot to show the impact of the pressure on households as a result of all of this. So people have to spend way bigger to effectively just get somewhere to live. And interestingly, the latest from Roy Morgan also showed that the mortgage stress numbers on their definitions, it's not the same definition as mine, is up again. So already a lot of pressure on households, which of course will continue. And the problem, of course, is that as interest rates get cut, what happens is that prices rise, which means that you can actually get a bigger mortgage, which means that you actually can get more leverage up. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's less affordable or more affordable than it was previously. So affordability is still shot.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the chart on that slide, at the bottom right chart compares average loan size and dwelling prices. And what it shows, it's this one here. I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor,
Yep.
but it's this one here just comes from Alex Joyner, from Chief Economist at IFM Investors. He's a brilliant economist. It's from last year, but it basically, it plots average loan size and dwelling prices all the way back to, the mid-90s. And you can see that they pretty much follow each other in lockstep, right? So obviously, if we're going to have all these, these new mortgage products, we're going to have all this new demand side stimulus, we're going to have lower interest rates, etc., all designed basically for people to take out bigger mortgages, or if not, in the case of shared equity, not necessarily bigger mortgages, but to pay more for property because the government will be taking on some of that. The goal is to pump the quote unquote bubble even bigger. That is the fundamental goal of these policies. And you got to ask yourself, so if we've got lenders now doing 40-year mortgage terms, well, when I was a young kid, not that I was following this stuff back then, but if you go back to the early 80s, it was about 15-year loan terms were sort of the norm. And then they went to 25, and then 30, and now 40. And how long is it going to be till we've got half-century mortgages and then intergenerational mortgages? Well, I guess half-century really are intergenerational almost. And, the goal of this stuff is you lower the monthly repayment by extending terms, etc., whatever. That makes your repayment more affordable in the short term, right? So for a given size mortgage, you don't have to pay as much per month. but you extend the repayment period over a much longer period. So your people spend more of their lifetime income on housing. And what tends to happen is if someone could borrow 800,000 before under a 30-year mortgage, and then under a 40-year mortgage, suddenly because of their repayments have gone down, they can borrow $1 million. Well, you tend to see more people do just borrow more, and then they'll bid up the price of homes. And I think that chart from Alex Joyner pretty much sums it up in a picture, exactly what you can expect from this. Higher mortgage debt and higher prices. That's effectively it. And Labor's 5% deposit scheme is an absolute disaster in this regard, because if people are going to put down less money for a mortgage with the taxpayer backing up more, they can get in earlier, they can spend more. It'll just pump prices. All these policies are there to pump prices. They're not there to make housing more affordable. It's not going to make housing more affordable. You do not solve an expensive housing problem, like a problem of having houses that cost too much, by pushing up their price, right? That's just stupid. You don't solve, if you're paying $2 a litre for petrol, you don't go, oh, you know what? We're going to make it $2.50. That'll make it more affordable. But in order to make it $2.50, we're going to, like that. It's just, it doesn't make sense. You've got to lower the structural cost of housing. And we're not doing that. All the policies in Australia are about not doing that, whether it's all these things I've just mentioned, or it's pumping migration or whatever. It's all about making the problem worse, but pretending that you're making it better, but you're actually making it worse. And that's what we've done. Let's face it, we've done it for 25 years. We've had first home buyer grants at the turn of the century. We've had a whole bunch of policies left, right, and centre from state and federal governments. And again, the end result has been that chart from Alex Joyner showing prices rising, mortgages rising, houses more expensive than they've ever been. So was it Albert Einstein who said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? That's what we're doing. We're just copying the playbook we've done for the last 25 years and doubling down and pouring, doubling it down with steroids. And then politicians are trying to pretend that they're going to make housing more affordable for you. It's just laughable, it really is.
Yeah, and of course, a part of that is a lot of taxpayer money is going routed back into the property sector directly or indirectly, first owner grants and all of those things. And we've got the tax breaks as well, which is also bubbling it up. But it's interesting, if you compare Australia with New Zealand and Canada, both of whom had a very significant bubble up, but then actually pulled some of the levers to bring migration down and to get a grip on some of those property exuberances, and looking also investors as well. And guess what? Property prices in New Zealand are down more than 16% from their peak. And in Canada, rentals are actually dropping. So it shows there are levers that are available if people wanted to pull them.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'd love to see Australia copy Canada in particular. So, because Canada and Australia, as much as we should be closer to New Zealand, and in many ways we are, but I reckon Canada is actually more of a similarity to Australia than what New Zealand is. So if you think about Canada, like most of Australia's population is on the East Coast, right? Where it's dominated by the East Coast. We're close to the water. We've got an unpopulated interior with a few people living on the West Coast and, South Australia. But Canada's kind of similar. Canada's crammed into the southern areas of the country because the rest of it's pretty unhospitable, very cold, etc., and, desolate. They've got, I think it's 5 or 6 major banks. We've got 4. Population of 42 million versus our 27, so not huge. Similar, political systems. So both Westminster system, upper and lower house, just like the UK. There's a lot of similarities. We both run huge immigration programs. Ours has been bigger over the last 20 years, but Canada's has been bigger over the last 5, for example. And we've had all the same problems. We've both got very disturbingly poor economies where basically we've had per capita recessions for years, even though the aggregate economies continue to grow. We've both had woeful productivity. Ours has been slightly worse, but Canada's productivity has been absolutely terrible as well. And a lot of that gets down to capital shallowing, because both in Australia and Canada, we've had low business investment at the same time as a run very strong population growth. So as a result, the capital to labour ratio, which is the measure of capital deepening, if you increase the labour ratio via immigration, that's the denominator, and you don't invest enough to keep up with it, you're going to have falling. You're going to basically have less capital per worker and less productivity. And that's exactly what Australia and Canada have experienced. And then on the housing side, we both experienced, we both had record post-COVID migration through the roof. Canada was even worse than Australia, but both terrible, highest in our histories. We both experienced generational rental crisis. We both, jacked up house prices. But the difference is Canada had a backlash, and their previous government, fearing election defeat, they got re-elected, obviously, after Trump, but they actually put a 3-year immigration freeze, and they're actually following through on it. So they had effectively zero population growth in the first quarter. In the fourth quarter of last year, they had near zero population growth. Mark Carney is the new Prime Minister who took over from Justin Trudeau, same party, the Liberal Party, which is basically the same and similar to our Labor Party, the left-leaning party, has committed to continuing this 3-year population freeze. The opposition leader, which is effectively their Liberal Party, they should have won the election, but after Trump arced up and threatened Canada, they likened him to Trump because he was the conservative leader. He was the conservative side. He has been calling for immigration cuts, so to actually send people home. Right? He actually wants population reduction now. But regardless, Canada has frozen their population growth, and as a result, their property prices have fallen quite sharply, and their rents, they've experienced something like 8 consecutive months of falling asking rents. So they are actively solving their housing crisis by not growing the population and allowing construction and everything else to catch up. New Zealand is a bit different. So New Zealand has just had an absolutely crap economy, and their immigration has plunged to a 2.5-year low. So it's very, very low, about half what it was, I think, pre-COVID. So it's historically lowish levels, like not low in if you take the very long historical, but certainly low in comparison to the last 20 years. And New Zealand now, not just because of this, they also clamped down negative gearing, did a whole bunch of other policies. But New Zealand, after experiencing the sharpest house price rise in the advanced world during the pandemic, has actually seen all of that retrace. And their real house prices now are back to 2019 levels. So they experienced an epic boom and then an epic bust in house prices. Their rents, the rental inflation's also stalled. So housing is getting rapidly more affordable in New Zealand because prices have fallen at the same time as interest rates are coming down. So now New Zealand is looking at affordable housing. The problem with New Zealand, though, Martin, is that their government, they have a conservative government now. Chris Luxon, he's an ex-CEO, and he's a business guy, right? He unfortunately has announced 3 policies to ramp up immigration, and the worst type of immigration. So he's announced that he basically wants to expand parental visas into New Zealand. So that's basically allowing migrants who are in New Zealand to bring over their elderly parents, which is just moronic policy. It's going to age the population. It's going to add to infrastructure and other pressures, housing pressures a bit. But it's also going to cost the New Zealand taxpayer oodles of money because those people aren't going to work, but they're going to draw on infrastructure and services. And New Zealand has a crowded hospital system like everywhere else in the UK, Australia, Canada, everywhere. So the last thing you want to do is add a whole bunch of old people using that hospital system. But Luxon wants to do that. He's also announced that he wants to ramp up golden ticket visas. Now, that's effectively allowing so-called wealthy people to buy residency in New Zealand. Now, those golden ticket visas, the Productivity Commission in Australia, we had a similar program, called for their abolition years ago because they tend to attract older people who cannot speak English and they're used as conduits for money laundering. Well, New Zealand wants to ramp those up. Pretty stupid policy. At the same time as they also want to ramp up international students. So I should say non-genuine international students. So they've announced that they're going to expand work hours for international students from 20 hours a week to 25 hours a week. And the idea there is to encourage a whole bunch of students, primarily from South Asia, who tend to come to places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc., for work rights and permanent residency instead of studying. That's their primary goal. They want to attract those people. So they want to expand work rights for international students from 20 hours a week to 25, and effectively turn student visas into de facto low-skilled work visas and residency visas. So the New Zealand government has seen, they've basically said, oh, gee, our economy's not working. We've had recessionary conditions for years. We need to ramp up population growth to get it going. But the problem is it's very low quality immigration they're targeting. It's the lowest of quality. I'd say it's scraping the bottom of the barrel, just to generate some headline growth. At the same time, they're going to make the per capita situation worse. They're going to make the New Zealand government budget worse. And they're going to make the housing situation, infrastructure situation, productivity situation even worse. And ultimately, they're going to end up with a much worse economy. And it's the last thing they should be doing. But the government is panicking, I think. They're looking at the GDP numbers and the housing market, coming back to affordability, et cetera. And they want to pull a lever. And the easiest lever for them to pull is immigration. But they're going for the real low quality immigration. Elderly parents, money laundering visas, and non-genuine students. I mean, how dumb can you get?
Yeah, and it just shows you, doesn't it, that there is a great temptation from the treasury operations within these countries to look at the GDP number as being the sacred must grow at all costs. And so when things are looking a bit shaky, what you do is you try and pull the levers, and the migration lever is an obvious lever at one level, because you can do it relatively quickly, and the number goes up even if the GDP per capita doesn't go up. And in fact, there's a poll I launched before we started the show. I asked people what they thought we should do about migration in Australia. Somebody said, yeah, you should actually be having a more aggressive option as well as the ones I put up there. But the point is, I'll be interested to see what people think here. To my mind, though, migration is a Ponzi scheme. And migration is part of the quantitative, growth.
Really?
Yeah, exactly. So, you can QE the money, but you can QE people as well.
Yeah, and I'd rather see them QE the money, to be quite frank, because at least with QE the money, it's it blows financial bubbles, but it doesn't affect your traffic congestion. It doesn't force you to live in a shoebox apartment because you can't afford a house, and there's too many people to competing with you for a house. It doesn't turn your cities into high-rise shoebox metropolises. I've said this previously. So I live in Melbourne, right? And so Melbourne's population in the year 2000 was 3.5 million people, and I'd argue that Melbourne in the 90s was an absolutely fantastic place to live. It was so good. It had great culture. It was easy to get around. It was very affordable, both for housing and other stuff. It was great. It really was. And, and probably Sydney as well. I mean, I only visited Sydney to visit my cousin, etc. But, if you think anyone here is old enough, you think back to Sydney at the time of the Sydney Olympics, and you ask yourself, was it better when we had 3.8 million people at the turn of the century? Just think back to where you were at the Sydney Olympics and what life was like. Or is it better now? I think pretty much everyone would say it was better then, right? Now, so Melbourne's 3.5 million people at the turn of the century. It's added roughly 2 million people since then. So not even 25 years, because the data only goes to 2024. Melbourne has added about 2 million people, right? So that's a huge volume of people in less than a quarter of a century. The state government's own forecasts say that Melbourne's going to go to 9 million people by 2050, right? So it took us 165 years to get to 3.5 million people at the turn of the century. But we're going to add 3.5 million people from now until 2050, according to the Victorian government. Think about that. So that's only, 35 years? 25 years. So in 25 years, you're going to add 3.5 million people. Something that took us 165 years to do, to get to that at the turn of the century. It just does not, this is not going to work. Melbourne has gone down the hole in the last 25 years as we've added 2 million people. Crime is rampant. We've got traffic congestion everywhere. Nothing works anymore. The roads have got potholes everywhere. The state government is drowning in debt. It's frantically trying to build infrastructure projects to keep up, but can never do it. It's got boondoggle projects that are so far, past due by date and costing so much more than they ever expected, which arguably wouldn't have been needed if we hadn't grown the population. We've got literally people living in the northwest of the city of Melbourne in places like Melton and Bacchus Marsh, which are high growth areas, which are expected to take hundreds of thousands of migrants who are operating on diesel trains, right? So these places have seen massive growth in the last 20 years through immigration, yet they operate on old-fashioned V-line diesel trains, right? I mean, they haven't even electrified these places, right? And we're going to just keep piling more and more people in these areas, more and more people across the city, and magically, where the state government claims that we're going to have better living standards. And it's like, I also ask, Mum, what does Melbourne do? Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to earn a living? How are we going to pay our way in the world? I mean, Victoria in the last, this century has seen very little growth in their exports, but our imports have gone through the roof. So our trade deficit is just skyrocketed. And it was about $20 billion our trade deficit about, I think it was 20 years ago, 2005. And it's now about $90 billion, the trade deficit in Victoria, in real terms. This is adjusted for inflation. And the reason why it's gone up so much is that we've imported loads of consumers who buy imported stuff, but we don't actually sell anything to the rest of the world. The only thing that we supposedly sell is international education, right? Which is, most of that's fake anyway. The exports there are contrived anyway. They don't account for remittances that are sent home. They don't. They count all expenditure by international students as an export, even though most of them work here and they earn their money here. So the whole thing is just an absolute joke. And the state government wants to grow Melbourne to 9 million people, and then try and argue to our face that life's going to be better. It's going to be worse. We're going to be living in shoebox apartments. We're going to have massive traffic congestion. Crime's probably going to keep going. We've got a whole problem with machetes in Melbourne now. Home invasions are rampant. I know, literally at night when I go to sleep, I lock everything like Fort Knox. You're always sort of sleeping with an ear open. The reason why you do that is because a whole bunch of houses where I live, which is a nice area of Melbourne, have been broken into and have had home invasions and cars stolen and things like that. You hear about it all the time. You see the videos posted on social media, and this crazy state government, which has got the lowest credit rate in the country, the highest debt, the highest per capita debt, just wants to keep doing what we've been doing for the last 20 years, which hasn't worked and has made everyone's life more miserable. They want to just keep doing it, and they want to keep telling us that life's going to be better. It's just, Melbourne's a microcosm of Australia, right? The problem with this country, but it's probably the worst case of Australia, because it doesn't sell anything. Like, all we do is we import people to build houses for them, to sell, imported junk to, and to make coffees for. That is Melbourne's entire business model. And it doesn't pay its way in the world. It basically relies on the rest of the country to suck resources in from everywhere else to pay for it. And it is literally a parasite on Australia, Melbourne. And unfortunately, the goal is to make Melbourne a bigger parasite by growing it to 9 million people and making everyone's lives who live there, apart from the uber rich, worse.
Yeah, well, I've always had the view that we've got a housing economy with a little bit of the rest of the economy bolted on around the edge, a little bit of mining over here and not much else. And it's certainly got worse and worse in recent times. Interestingly, I made a show the other day when I went through and looked in detail at the Melbourne suburban house trends over the last decade. And there's a lot of areas where prices have fallen, actually, rather than have risen, which is quite interesting. So go on.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say that's one thing the government probably inadvertently has gotten right. So they've obviously, because they're scrounging for any, dollars behind the mattress, under the bed, behind the couch to try and solve their budget dilemma, which is, deplorable. They have whacked property investors. Now, I could understand if you're a property investor and you're hearing this, and you're hearing me talk, you're probably throwing tomatoes at your screen, right? But if you look at it from a housing affordability perspective, it has actually worked pretty well, right? So they've raised a whole bunch of taxes on property investors. So as a result, property investors basically sold up. We've seen lots of property investors sell up in Melbourne. The number of rental bonds that are on issue, which is a classic case of it, has actually fallen quite sharply in Melbourne and Victoria, which has never happened before. So the number of homes that are available for rent has shrunk because a whole bunch of investors have sold up because of the taxes and etc. And it hasn't actually impacted asking rents because typically when investors sell, most of them sell to first home buyers, right? So instead of a young person being a renter, they become home buyers. So it doesn't actually affect the rental supply and demand mix. But what it has done is it has put downward pressure on prices. And as a result, Melbourne is now one of the most affordable housing markets in the country because of this investor exodus, principally. And also that, look, let's face it, the economy down here sucks as well. And we've seen a lot of people leave Melbourne to go to Queensland, etc. So there's that as well. But that has been one of the things that I think this government has inadvertently got right. It hasn't meant to do it that way, but it has actually, by taxing investors very harshly, it has pushed down prices for those who just want to buy a home to live in, and also without increasing rents. So I think that's actually been a pretty good thing. And the counterfactual is Brisbane, which before the pandemic had a much cheaper housing market than Melbourne. I remember looking at it going, "Wow, that place is cheap." Now is far more expensive than Melbourne. And Brisbane now is the second most expensive housing market in the country. It was always Sydney, then Melbourne. Now Melbourne has, I think, is cheaper than Perth, Brisbane, and I think even Adelaide. So this policy by the state government has actually worked inadvertently.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And, I always have to underscore to everyone that you have to look granularly to look at what's going on, because different suburbs are behaving differently. But certainly this trend of investors in Melbourne jumping ship is very significant and quite concerning, because, of course, the rental sector has been outsourced to private investors for a generation or two. And so it puts more pressure on those in the rental sector. And I noticed that the rents are still rising in Melbourne. So, there's a big thing. But I guess there's a broader question here, Leith, because we're talking here about the property situation. And, there are things that could be done to try and actually change the game. Perhaps not try and target higher home prices, perhaps target the migration question. But the fundamental economic problem we've got is that if you dial back migration, then the GDP goes down, which means that the overall economy gets even worse. So this takes us quite nicely into the broader conversation about productivity. And I think that's probably where we should shift the conversation to a little now, because to my mind, this upcoming talk fest that Chalmers is now running, well, I'm not sure whether it's going to come up with anything useful at the end of it, but there is a massive question about productivity. In other words, how do we actually create more momentum? And you said earlier on, the NDIS was part of the issue, all those government-created jobs directly or indirectly. All of the data suggests that actually productivity is hard to cure in Australia.
Yeah, and so I wrote an article on Macrobusiness Monday, and was on basically explained why Australia's productivity is in terminal decline, and also gave the reason why I wrote that article is I gave an interview on it on Sunday night with 2GB, a big a 15-minute interview on explaining this dilemma, and it was all the interviewer Mike Jeffries wanted to ask me about it because of this talk fest that Treasurer Chalmers has set up. Basically look at how to fix Australia's productivity, and quick spoiler, they won't fix it because they won't fix the underlying problems. But I basically attributed Australia's productivity collapse to four main factors. And sorry, before I do that, can I just I'll put this chart up showing just where we're at with productivity, if you don't mind. So the middle chart here, which I'm hopefully you can see my cursor, I'm circling. That's from Justin Farbo from Antibody and Macro. And what it shows is that Australia's labour productivity is basically which is GDP per hour worked. So it's how much economic growth we derive out of every hour worked. it's basically been stagnant since 2016, right? So it's had it's basically been flat since 2016. It's the worst performance in the advanced world. Canada has also been very poor, but we've had the worst productivity growth. If you look over here on the left side, upper left chart, it breaks down our productivity growth by, again, as I mentioned earlier, the market sector, which is basically the private sector, versus the non-market sector, which is, as I said before, is those in the economy that are effectively government-funded type roles. So NDIS, public servants, etc. Unfortunately, while the market sectors experience pretty decent growth, productivity growth, labour productivity growth over the last 20 years, unfortunately, the non-market sector has actually experienced zero productivity growth in 20 years, and that is one of the reasons why Australia has such poor productivity. As I mentioned earlier, about 60% of the jobs since the pandemic have been in this non-market sector. Most of those related to the NDIS. The NDIS has grown in costs, grown in number of people working in it, etc. Has ballooned in costs in the last 5 years. It's also projected to roughly double in nominal terms over the next decade to about 100 million people. As we've done that, we have a higher share of the population working in this non-market sector, that necessarily means you're going to get lower productivity growth. But it's not the only driver. So that's one of the drivers for Australia's poor productivity growth. It's actually probably a minor driver, I'd say, in the scheme of things. Another one is that we've deindustrialised. So I have this chart elsewhere in this pack, but Australia's manufacturing share shrunk from about 15% in the late 70s to 5% of Australia's economy currently. And even 20 years ago, it was about 10% of the economy. So we've got this shrinking manufacturing sector. We're deindustrialising. And the reason why we're doing that has been a whole bunch of reasons. So obviously we abolished tariffs in the 1980s, which meant that our manufacturing became less competitive against manufacturing overseas, which shrunk manufacturing. We also had obviously the commodity boom during the 2000s commodity price boom that pushed up the Australian dollar. So if you're listening to this, you might remember when the Australian dollar actually surpassed the US dollar. We had a very high currency there for a while, and what they did was that shrunk our manufacturing sector. That was one of the reasons why the auto sector left, because it became cheaper to make cars in Korea than in Australia because the Australian dollar was too high. And then more recently, and this is the biggest structural problem I think we've got going forward, is we've given ourselves expensive energy prices. And we'll touch on this a bit later, but Australia's energy costs are rocketing because of the, strive towards net zero, which has just added a whole bunch of cost to everything, as well as we've stuffed up the gas market. And these higher energy costs, both gas and electricity, have meant that it's become uneconomic to manufacture in Australia. And in the last several years, we've seen thousands of manufacturers go under. But we've seen some really big ones too. So Australia's last plastic manufacturer, Quenos, went broke last year, closed shop. Now we don't make plastics in Australia anymore. Our last architectural glass maker, Oceanic Glass, which did the windows for Parliament House in Canberra, they closed this year because of high gas prices. The plastic manufacturer shut down because of high gas prices as well. We've seen, fertilizer makers like Incitec Pivot downsize and close their operations. Orica, which makes explosives for mining and fertilizers, is looking to downsize as well. Left, right, and centre, these high energy costs are deindustrialising the country. And why that matters is because manufacturing across the world is one of the key drivers of productivity growth, because it's one area where you can invest in more technology, in more machines, etc., and get more output for every input that you put into it. You can increase the capital to labour ratio. You can get more productivity. But as we've shrunk manufacturing to the lowest share in the OECD, we have the lowest manufacturing share in the advanced world. It means that we've become more reliant on these services type jobs, these non-market jobs, etc., which are low productivity, and that has killed our productivity as well. And related to this, we also had capital deepening. So the chart on the top right-hand side shows this in detail, and that's from Jared Minnack. The capital to labour ratio, which is basically the amount of equipment, tools, machinery, etc., that workers have to work with. It's basically the amount of capital divided by the number of workers gives you the capital labour ratio. That has absolutely collapsed, and it's collapsed for two reasons. Firstly, partly due to the manufacturing collapse. Our capital investment is sort of running at early 90s recessionary levels. So we're not growing the capital base very much. Part of that's because manufacturing is dead. At the same time, we've grown the population, which is the denominator of that capital labour ratio, aggressively through this high immigration. So Australia's population has grown by 8.7 million people, 46% this century so far. That is the highest growth in the advanced world. That has increased the labour, the denominator of that ratio, and as a result, we've had less machinery, tools, technology, etc., per worker, which has killed our productivity. And Ken Henry, some other researchers, the Productivity Commission, etc., have said that capital deepening, which is an increase in the capital labour ratio, has been the main driver of Australia's productivity growth since the Second World War. And unfortunately, that has gone into decline. We've now got capital shallowing because we're growing the population aggressively, and we're not building enough business. We're not doing enough business investment, infrastructure investment, all that sort of thing to keep up with it. And as a result, we're getting less output per worker, and we're getting declining productivity. And the final reason, Martin, to cut this long-winded story short, we've obviously got this housing obsession, which we've discussed pretty deep, a lot of detail in this podcast already. And classic example, it's shown in the bottom right chart, where I've compared housing, so mortgage versus business credit. And back in 1990, around 2/3 of bank lending was for businesses, and the rest was for mortgages and personal loans. Nowadays, it's nearly 3/4 of bank lending is now for mortgages, and they lend very little for businesses. About 1/3 is for businesses now. So we've restructured the entire economy in the last 30 years to be so focused on housing. And what that's done is it's bled the productive side, the real economy of capital investment, which is another reason why I've got this low, this low share of business investment, which is leading to capital shallowing problem. We've become so obsessed with housing that we've killed entrepreneurialism, we've killed investment, and that is also killing our productivity. And sure, there are other minor factors like Australia's our perverse franking credit system, which basically, we have a dividend imputation system here, which isn't common around the world. And what that's done is it's basically encouraged companies to pay high dividends rather than reinvesting in their businesses and into capital investment. So that has been another bit part, reason why we don't invest enough, but it's only a minor thing. But those are basically the four main reasons. We've deindustrialized. We've got this capital shallowing problem because of excessive population growth and not enough investment to keep up with that population growth. We've seen a massive rise in these non-market jobs through things like the NDIS, which are by nature very low productivity. And then finally, we've got this housing obsession in Australia, which has just starved the country of capital for productive purposes, for businesses, for, entrepreneurialism has been killed by the housing obsession, because when you've got a mortgage, you don't want to take risk, right? So I remember it myself when I was working at Goldman Sachs and I had a pretty hefty mortgage. I was very reluctant to start Macrobusiness, and I only did it because I got my mortgage down to a level where I could afford to go a year because I'd already prepaid a lot of it. A year without income before I was going to basically have to sell my house, and I could take the punt. But if you've got a massive mortgage debt hanging over your head, you're not going to take those sorts of risks. You're not going to try and be an entrepreneur or, try something new and invest. And also, why would you do that when it seems like, everyone's got it ingrained in their brains that the way to get rich is to, their idea of investment is not to invest into a new business venture. It's just to buy an investment property and sit on the capital gains and watch it go up in value. So that unfortunately is the Australian disease. And, these are all the factors, the reason why Australia has a very poor productivity. And I can't see this changing at this summit from Treasurer Jim Chalmers. And it's not going to change because as we've seen, the Albanese government's own policies are to pump the housing bubble even higher. They're not going to change that. They're not going to wind back immigration. In fact, the Centre for Population, which is in the Australian Treasury, their own population forecast for Australia are for the population to grow by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. Now, that's like adding another Sydney, another Melbourne, and another Brisbane, those three cities combined. So if you imagine those three cities now as they currently stand, all the people in those cities, all the housing required, all the business investment required, the Centre for Population forecasts that we're going to grow by Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, 13.5 million people in just 40 years. Well, obviously, if we're going to add that many people, we're going to need that many people's worth of infrastructure, that many people's worth of business investment, that many people's worth of houses, etc., just to ensure that the capital labour ratio remains constant, let alone increases. And the fact of the matter is, with that scale of population growth, we can't deepen our capital. We can't increase that capital labour ratio because we're going to be growing the denominator, the labour, the population, too aggressively. So that's not going to change from this summit. They're not going to suddenly go, you know what, we're going to abandon big Australia. No, it's ingrained, right? They're not going to fix the energy market. Like, if anything, Labor has said that they're going to double down on net zero, and they're going to go harder to, shut down our reliable, cheap, historically cheap baseload power, our coal power, etc., and replace it with intermittent, expensive renewables that don't provide enough power, don't provide power when you need it, cost an absolute fortune in transmission lines and backup storage and all this other stuff. And that's just going to push up our energy costs. So if we have higher energy costs, we're going to continue to deindustrialize, and we're going to have lower productivity growth. So, the three areas here, the housing obsession, the capital problem, the capital deepening, capital shallowing / capital shallowing problem we've got, and the energy problem, which is related to deindustrialization, are going to remain no matter what this summit comes up with. They might come up with a few little nips and tucks at the edges, but the fact of the matter is, it's not going to solve the structural problems of the country. And it could make it even worse. Like, what I fear, Martin, is that we're going to have a repeat of the 2022 Jobs and Skills Summit, right? So if people remember that summit was stacked with participants, with shills, with pro-migration shills. And the whole purpose of that summit was to be used as a Trojan horse to ramp immigration, to get a fake consensus to ramp immigration to levels that we've never seen before. And as soon as that summit was over, Claire O'Neill, who was the Home Affairs Minister at the time, and Albo, and everyone got up there saying, "Oh my God, I just can't believe how much consensus there is. Everyone thinks we need to massively increase immigration. Wow! So here's our recommendations from the summit: more permanent migration, more temporary migration, relaxed student rules, increased work hours for students, a whole bunch of other stuff, and voila, we got record immigration. Right? It was preordained. That whole summit was rigged to ramp immigration because the government needed cover, needed political cover, it needed a Trojan horse to do so without it, so it can look like, oh, look, I was just doing what the summit said. I fear that this productivity summit is going to be used as a Trojan horse to double down even harder on net zero, on other policies that it wants to run, which would actually make the productivity situation even worse. And they'll use it to strike up a fake consensus at the end of it, and they'll use it as a Trojan horse and political cover to basically double down on dumb policies. And they did that in the 2022 Jobs and Skills Summit, and I think I'd be very shocked if they didn't try and do that again. So, no, this is not going to amount to anything of substance for us, and it's not going to improve the trajectory of the country.
No, it seems to me it's predominantly performative, and as you say, it gives them a passport to do the things they wanted to do anyway. It's interesting that we had a little super chat question come in a little while ago, which was to do with AI. And thanks for the super chat, by the way. I really appreciate it. Will AI lead to layoffs or restructuring of the future economy? And if so, what does it mean for all the people we've imported? So that's a good question. If you've got poorly skilled people, they're probably going to have less jobs rather than more jobs. The other side of it is there an opportunity to use AI to improve productivity? Well, marginally, but my own view is that hanging your hat on an AI-predominated future could well be something they sort of talk about, but it's not going to tackle those fundamental issues that you've highlighted, Leith. I mean, these are fundamental structural issues around housing, around migration, around the investment profile, and particularly the private sector. And of course, the private sector, particularly, a lot of them require energy. And of course, the problem is that the energy landscape is, well, it's absolutely abysmal. You know, the costs of energy in Australia is so high now that effectively it's impossible for businesses to grow and develop here. And we do seem to be shunting ourselves into a bit of a cul-de-sac. And, you know, you can pile up all of the reasons why we are where we are, but there are also levers that can be pulled around migration, around the housing issues we've touched on in terms of changing some of the things there, and energy. So maybe we should link that. And by the way, energy is linked to AI because, of course, the AI system requires two massive things: a massive amount of energy and a massive amount of water. And guess what we're short of?
Absolutely. You know, it's crazy. So you know, and the other thing is with AI, it needs consistent energy, right? So it needs, and same if you're an aluminium smelter, right? If you're an aluminium smelter or your AI, you can't have an intermittent energy source that works when the weather conditions are favorable. You need stable energy that is 24/7. And in the case of an aluminium smelter, I think those things can go only a couple hours without energy before you have to throw them away, and they've got to basically shutter them, because once the aluminium dries, right, that's been smelted, it's gone, right? And this is what Spain and Portugal experienced. They actually, I think it was one of their aluminium smelters actually was shut down after their blackout because they were offline for so long that the smelter basically seized up and broke, and you can't get it back. I don't know exactly how it works, but that's just, I read about that. So, you know, unfortunately, Australia is committing the worst case of energy suicide, the most unnecessary self-sabotage that I've ever seen in my life. And honestly, this might sound hyperbolic, but I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I mean, serious. Energy now is the number one existential threat, I think, to Australia, right? It is. We have jumped the shark so badly on this, and I fear literally for the future of the country if we can keep going down this road. I mean, I fear for it for a whole bunch of reasons, but I think energy now is probably front and center. So, just as a quick, you know, a quick primer in case you knew, the Albanese government has committed to a 82% renewable energy target by the end of the decade. And by 2050, we're supposed to be, you know, so-called net zero, right? So emissions free. Impossible, not going to work. But anyway. And to get to 82% renewable energy target, we're going to basically shut down our baseload power. So our reliable baseload coal generators that have been running for generations on end, which have historically provided us with stable, reliable, and very cheap energy. You know, growing up, the electricity bill was a nothing burger, right? I remember growing up in in Melbourne, and my mum's always, you know, very strong about turn off the lights, etc. But we always ran the heaters and all that sort of stuff. We had obviously cheap gas as well, but the energy bill was never an issue. Whereas now, it costs an absolute arm and a leg, and it's just getting worse and worse. And you got to ask yourself, why are we doing this when us as a country, we export 7 times more coal than we burn? I think the last time I said it was 6 times. It's actually 7 times more coal than we use ourselves. And we export 4 times more gas than we use ourselves. And we've also banned even looking at nuclear, despite the fact that we hold about 30% of the world's uranium reserves, and we could be totally energy self-sufficient. But we've banned going down that road, despite the fact that the UK is now going down that road. They've already got some nuclear reactors. They're going to build more. Canada's building more. Everywhere else in the world's going down this road except for us, and I think New Zealand. And it's just moronic. What are we doing here? So I've got some charts here, Martin, just to show the idiocy of Australia's net zero approach. And I showed some of this last time. I've got some new stuff as well. The chart on the top left plots Australia's carbon emissions against, you know, other major countries, right? Now, obviously, Australia's a rounding error. We're about 1% of the world's carbon emissions. We've actually reduced our share from about 1.5% in 2000 to 1.1% currently, right? China is about 31.5%, or end of 2023 was 31.5% of the world's carbon emissions. You can see by that chart that China has just gone through the roof. India is expanding at a rapid pace. Everyone else is pretty much coming down or flat like Australia. I've got a chart just next to that in the middle, top middle. Now, this is by a guy called Robert Bryce, who's a US energy expert. He gave an absolutely brilliant talk a couple of weeks back, which I've taken some charts from there. It's fantastic. All the data is from the International Energy Agency, from reputable sources. And it just shows there, this is the top middle chart. It plots, China and India have increased their carbon emissions from the year 2000. China and India combined from 18% to 40%. Australia's cut theirs from 1.5% to 1.1%, right? The US has cut theirs. The whole developed world's cut theirs. Us, as a rounding area on the global, on the world stage, who sells its coal to China and India, is saying that we must ourselves get abandoned coal, right? This is moronic stuff. China and India have about 1,400 coal-fired generators. Australia has 18. They are expanding their coal-fired generators every single year. I've got a chart over the page I'll show you in a sec. China burns 30% more coal than the rest of the world combined. That's the chart on the bottom left, if you want to check that. The chart in the bottom middle shows the change in carbon emissions in the 6 largest economies between 2000 and 2023. Look at China and India. They have ramped their carbon emissions like no tomorrow, whereas the developed world has cut theirs, right? This is ridiculous. So we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot. We're going to not use our coal when we literally export 7 times more coal than we use ourselves. At the same time as we sell that coal to China, China and India are also digging up their own coal at an increasing rate to burn themselves. What are we doing here? This makes no sense. Now, the chart on the left, this is from a post that Tarek Brooker is going up in Macrobusiness tomorrow. But it's not from him, but it shows the new coal-fired power plants that were added in 2024 versus the ones that were shut down. So green is the ones shut down, red are the ones added. You can see that China and India have expanded a massive amount of coal-fired generators, right? Whereas the developed world has basically shut theirs down. So we're all making sacrifices. We're cutting down our coal. Where, by we I mean not just Australia, it's also the other developed countries. While China and India are going absolutely gangbusters, burning coal like you wouldn't believe. They're now spending as much on new coal plants, this is the top middle chart, as the entire world is spending on gas plants. They're adding, they're also building nuclear plants, good on them, but they're not building nuclear plants nearly the rate that they're building coal plants. They're building coal-fired generators 5 times quicker than they're building nuclear plants. Nuclear plants are great because they're zero emission. So, I've got a chart there at the top right on the coal-fired generation, China, India, Australia, etc. It's just, Australia is such a rounding error in this stuff, whilst these countries are going absolutely hog wild on burning coal. And you've got to ask yourself, why are we committing energy suicide? Right. So I've got some charts, beautiful charts here. The middle one's there. Again, Australia's coal production versus domestic coal use between 2000 and 2023. We've ramped up production. We're selling it. We're selling a lot of that to China and India. We're consuming less of it. The chart just below that, the bottom middle chart is a longer term chart, goes all the way back to the 70s. The grey is the exports of coal. The yellow is the consumption of coal. Again, we're selling 7 times more coal than we're using ourselves. How about a logical person would say, instead of shutting down your baseload coal generators, right, and going down this stupid renewable path that doesn't deliver energy when you need it and is uber expensive, how about we just export a tiny bit less coal and burn it ourselves and actually open up a few more coal generators and give ourselves stable, reliable 24/7 power? And even better than that, while we're doing that, why don't we then build a few nuclear generators? Because nuclear generators are the cleanest source of energy, right? Not only are they zero emission, which is what the net zero heroes want. But they also have the lowest environmental footprint because they are the most energy dense. Now, I'll just say this, Martin. One nuclear generator is about the size of one Bunnings warehouse, right? So that gives you sort of the everyone goes to Bunnings, so you can picture that size. That's one nuclear generator. You got one set of transmission lines. That is your environmental footprint on a nuclear power plant, right? Yeah, yes, they use water, but so does coal, etc. But their environmental footprint, how much land use they use, is tiny. It is the most energy dense form of power. So one nuclear rod can last for, use basically, Catherine Porter, who's a UK energy expert, noted recently that if we ran on pure nuclear power, everyone's waste at the end of their life would fit into a Coke can worth of uranium. That's all it is. It's very little, right? Compare that to solar or wind turbines, which are, I guess, zero emission at the point of actually generating electricity. But to get the same amount of energy as one, say, 850 kilowatt nuclear generator or coal-fired generator, you need about 400 odd wind turbines, right? So the typical wind turbine is about 6 kilowatts. All the big new ones are about 6 megawatts each. To get 850 megawatts, to get the nameplate, which is just the capacity, you need about 140 of them. So that's, what's that, 850 divided by 6. Problem with it is wind only has a capacity factor of about 30%. So what that means is that if it's a 6 megawatt wind turbine, so that's the maximum it can produce. On average, you only get 30% of that because often wind it's not windy, right? So often you have, still periods, whatever. So that means you actually need about 3 times as much as that to get the 850 megawatts averaged out over the year. So you need about 420 odd wind turbines. So problem is though, there's going to be periods where there's no wind anywhere. There's going to be periods where there's wind everywhere, right? So in order to get stable generation, you then need a whole bunch of battery storage and pumped hydro and all this other crap. So instead of having one generator that can do 24/7 power reliably, independent of the weather, it's dispatchable, you've got to have 400 odd wind turbines with a truckload of battery backup storage, pumped hydro and all this other crap, so you can store it when it's windy and then use it when it's not. The environmental cost of this is unbelievable because a wind turbine and battery storage, you're lucky to get 20 years out of it. So in the life of one nuclear power plant, which can last about 60 years, you need to replace this stuff 3 times. Think about all the machines and everything else that goes into all this stuff. It's not environmentally friendly. The land use is unbelievable. The Victorian government has set 8% of the state aside for renewables, right? 8% of Victoria has been set aside as land use for solar generators and for solar panels and all this other crap. The environmental footprint of this stuff is absolutely ginormous. Every single wind turbine requires a metric, whatever ton, I don't want to use the swear word, of concrete to keep the 150 meter to 200 meter wind turbine in the air, right? So you need, 20 meters by 20 meters by 20 meters or whatever it is of concrete per wind turbine. That's a hell of a lot of concrete. It needs to be reinforced. That's a lot of resources that go into each one of these things. You need to build transmission lines, a spider web of transmission lines for these 400 odd wind turbines just to match one coal or nuclear generator, right? You need to build trenches for the power lines because you can't run them in the air because they get chopped by the wind blades. You need to plow a whole bunch of land to put the wind turbines on, or you got to build service roads to each of the wind turbines because they have to be serviced, right? So you got to bulldoze a whole bunch of stuff to be able to drive cars out to them to then service it, right? The environmental footprint of this stuff is unbelievable, right? So I argue, why not just burn the coal that we've got, which we sell 7 times more than we use domestically, burn a bit more of that and just stick with coal. And while you're doing that, build some nuclear generators, which are the most environmentally friendly option out of the lot. But they'll take, years to build. They're expensive up front, but they're cheap to run over the long term. and they last a hell of a long time. They have the smallest environmental footprint, and they are zero emission. Why isn't Australia doing that? We have 30% of the world's uranium. We're the biggest coal exporter. We've got oodles of the stuff. We export 7 times more than we use. And then we've got the gas problem, whereby we're the second biggest gas exporter in the world. And then we've made that expensive as well because we don't reserve the gas on the East Coast. On the East Coast at least, we're now looking at having to import gas, despite the fact we export nearly 3/4 of it. Like this country is so moronic when it comes to energy. We are shooting ourselves in the foot. We should be an energy superpower. We should have the lowest energy prices, other than, I'm not talking about oil here, but gas and electricity. We should have amongst the very lowest energy prices in the world. It should effectively be free, except for the cost of transport, right? Or, transmission, etc. The coal and gas, because we've got so much of it. But we stuff up everything. We've given ourselves expensive energy costs. We're precluding ourselves from using the energy that we've got. We've refused to mine more of it in the case of gas and coal. Like, what are we doing here? At the same time as we're happy to flog this stuff to China and India, who just burn it anyway and burn their own stuff, and are literally driving the world's rising carbon emissions. Like, it is mind-bogglingly stupid. If we keep going down this road and we keep driving up the cost of energy, every single link in the supply chain, it doesn't matter what business you're in, is going to become more expensive, because energy is the bedrock of the economy, right? If you want to have a modern economy and you want to progress, you've got to use more energy. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. China is getting more powerful and richer, etc., from using more energy. It's burning more coal. It's going down the nuclear road. It's actually building out renewables as well. But the fact of the matter is, regardless, it is using more types of all types of energy. Every year, its energy use just rockets. Same with India. It recognizes that its key to economic progress is to use more energy, right? By using energy, it means that instead of me having to dig a hole with a shovel, I can use a digger, because I'm using hydrocarbon energy to do that instead of my own power. Like, unfortunately, like it or not, hydrocarbons, fossil fuels are the reason that we live in the societies that we live in right now, right? There is no other way around it. And for us to have some of the biggest reserves of hydrocarbons in the world and to not use them ourselves, but then are happy to sell those hydrocarbons to other people to use, it's just moronic. We should be using this stuff ourselves first, and then we can sell the rest. But, again, would it really hurt if we sold 6 times more coal than we use ourselves, and use more ourselves instead of 7 times more coal? You export a bit less of this stuff, use it yourself, give yourself cheap and reliable energy. You'll actually be better for the environment, because instead of having to plow the environment with wind turbines and solar farms and all this other crap that needs to be replaced every 20 years and uses a hell of a lot of land, kills lots of birds, clears heaps of trees, etc. You don't need to do that stuff if you've got baseload power with single transmission lines to a centralized source, because they're so much more energy dense. Coal is energy dense. Nuclear is far more energy dense than coal, but both of them are way more energy dense than trying to harvest dispersed and diffuse wind and sun, which only work when the weather conditions are right. Like, the capacity factor on solar is like 20% or something, because voila, when it's cloudy, you get less, and it's only sunny for a certain period of the day. And especially winter down here in Melbourne, it's terrible. Wind, a 30% capacity factor, because often you get wind droughts, you get periods where the wind level's low, etc. So for these renewables to work, they've got to have optimal conditions, right? But we often don't have optimal conditions, and you need to be able to match energy supply with demand, right? So Australia's energy use peaks in the evening when people get home from work, etc. Well, guess what? Solar's useless then. And wind only works when the wind decides to blow. So how can you base an energy system on something which doesn't match supply with demand? And the only way you can match supply and demand is to have dispatchable power that you control, that is not dependent on the weather. And the moronic thing here is, Martin, about Australia is, there's all this concern about climate change. Some of it's real. I think it's exaggerated, but I believe climate change is a thing. But the the fact of the matter is, if the climate is going to become less predictable and more unstable, why would you base your energy system on something that's going to become less predictable and more unstable? Isn't that just moronic? Like, if it's going to be less predictable and more unstable, why would you base your energy system on that? Wouldn't it be smarter to base your energy system on something that you actually have control of? And if people are that concerned about, emissions and all that sort of stuff, you've got to go nuclear. And if you care about the environment and you care about having stable and reliable power and you care about emissions, nuclear is the only option that does all three. It's the only option that can give you zero emissions, can give you stable power, which you can control, it's dispatchable. You don't get that with renewables, and it's the only one that has the smallest environmental footprint because it takes a very tiny land area in one set of transmission lines versus, hundreds and hundreds of wind turbines and other stuff spread out around the land, bulldozing the land to put all this stuff, killing birds. It's just crazy, mate. Like, I can't stress enough how stupid Australia is going down this road. We are sitting on everything the world needs other than oil. So we should use some of it, right? We're happy to sell it to the rest of the world to use. Why don't we use it ourselves? It's just bonkers. Like, we should have the cheapest energy, some of the cheapest energy in the world. And guess what? If we did that, we would actually have a manufacturing sector. Quenos wouldn't have shut down if we had cheap energy. Oceanic Glass wouldn't have shut down if we had cheap energy. We'd have a whole bunch of other manufacturers that would still exist. It'd be cheaper to build homes here because Brickworks, which builds bricks that go into homes, their costs have gone up because of high gas prices. So if the cost of bricks goes up, it increases the cost of building housing. So this high energy cost just feeds into everything across the whole production line. It feeds into your cost of living. It feeds into inflation. It is the everything problem that is facing Australia. And the sad thing about it is, man, we shouldn't have to deal with this because unlike the UK, unlike a lot of European countries, unlike a lot of Asian countries, we have everything except for oil. So if we have all this stuff, it should be cheap because we've got an abundance, we've got an oversupply of all the stuff that you need to create energy. But we decide not to use it at the same time as we're happy to sell the same energy to other countries to use, like China and India, and just burn it. Why not burn it ourselves first? It's just crazy.
Yeah. And when you actually stand back and think about it, three observations come to mind. The first is, of course, who is benefiting from all of this shift? Well, there are a lot of corporations who are actually directly connected to the renewables sector, owning the towers and things. Secondly, of course, a lot of the industry is getting government support. So taxpayer money is going into these things to help bring them to fruition. And the third is, of course, because power is so high, the government has had to hand out huge amounts of money to households to reduce their energy bills so that the people can still afford to live in the places where they're living, which of course then means that we're sucking more of the tax take out and cycling it back round. And we're also, of course, making it harder and harder for people to be able to afford to do anything. So no surprise then they don't spend as much in the shops, and why the economic momentum in the economy is so weak. So to my mind, this idea that the energy conundrum is actually at the root cause of a lot of the issues that we've got in Australia, I think is a really important insight, right? And the ideological positioning that we've had for the last few years is based on a whole series of assumptions which are now proving not to be true.
Absolutely, and it's not just here. It's we've seen this globally. I put a chart. I should have mentioned it before, but this whole notion that you can magically transform your energy system into a renewable based system and you'll have cheap energy is just an absolute myth. It hasn't been done anywhere. The chart on the top left, which is from Robert Bryce, who's again the same guy, the energy expert, it actually comes from someone else, but he posted it. It basically shows that it plots. It's a scatter diagram of countries around the world, and it plots their renewable share versus their energy cost. And you can see that there's a very strong correlation. The higher the share of renewables, the higher energy costs. Right? It's not hard to understand. And just next to that on the right, you got the UK. UK, you're living there. You know what it's like. the UK under Ed Miliband, who's Ed Miliband, I should call him. He's an absolute idiot. He's as bad as Chris Bowen. He's drunk the net zero Kool-Aid, but to their credit, they've at least agreed to build nuclear generators now, right? Because they realise they can't do this renewable stuff. It's not going to work. It's not going to deliver them cheap and affordable power. So now they're going down belatedly going down the nuclear path. But in the UK, the energy costs have absolutely rocketed. That's shown in the red. And the wholesale price has gone up. But even more importantly, the total system cost has gone up because the cost of transmission is added. So the typical energy bill consists of three things, right? About 40% is the cost of generation, which is basically the wholesale cost. Around 40% is the network cost, which is the transmission lines and that sort of stuff. And then you got 20%, which are retail costs, as well as in Australia, it's renewable energy certificates. In the UK, it's contracts for difference. They're basically subsidies to renewables, right? Now, the renewables push up the wholesale costs, but they push up the transmission costs even more. And as a result, the cost of building out transmission lines gets added to the regulatory asset base, which then gets added to retail power bills. And that's why that red line has spiked. In California, so California's America's net zero hero, right? They're the ones who have gone further down the renewables road than anywhere else in the States. They're, wedded to a bit like us in Australia. They want to go net zero. They've got way more renewables than anywhere else. And as a result, California's got the most expensive energy in the US by a long shot, right? So, their energy costs have skyrocketed. The rest of the US haven't followed suit. To nearly the same extent because they haven't gone down this path. There's no chart here for Australia. There's Australia one down the bottom, which shows that our costs have gone up as well because of share of wind and solar and also expensive gas. But I should have included a chart on South Australia. So South Australia is the mainland's, renewable energy so-called superpower. So just over 70% of South Australia, nearly three-quarters of South Australia's total energy electricity, I should say, generation is now from renewables over the year. Now, that ignores the fact that it often imports brown coal power from Victoria through the interconnector, but we'll ignore that for a second. But South Australia has the most expensive electricity prices on the mainland in Australia. So, they've got the highest renewable energy share, but they've got the highest energy costs. So, unfortunately, the data doesn't lie. This is not cheaper. It's not cheaper anywhere. I'm sure there are some edge cases of places where energy probably is cheaper. Maybe Tasmania, because Tasmania has good old-fashioned hydro. So that's basically they get a lot of rainfall and they've got mountains and they're very small populations. They have old-fashioned hydroelectricity. That is excellent. Problem is you can't create more of it. So Victoria has some around the Snowy Mountains. There's obviously the original Snowy Mountains scheme in New South Wales, etc. But Australia is limited to being able to add more of that stuff. You either have the geology and the rainfall or you don't. We don't. So I'm sure there's some countries around the world which run on hydro, which probably have low energy costs, and they go, oh look, see, we're renewable, haven't got cheap energy costs. But leaving hydro aside, because you can't create more of that, you either have it or you don't. If you rely on wind and solar to form your energy grid, backed up with batteries and pumped hydro, which is a storage system, it's different. The fact of the matter is there's nowhere where energy costs have come down. That the higher the share of these things, the more expensive the energy. It's simple as that. And a lot of it gets down to this transmission costs because you need to build an absolute web of transmission lines. And you got to build so much more of this stuff than the nameplate suggests, right? So as I said before, to get 850 megawatts, which is about a large size hydro, traditional coal generator, you need, just to get the nameplate, to get 850 capacity, you need 146 megawatt wind turbines. The problem is, as I said before, they've got a capacity factor of 30%. So they only work about 30% of the time. They only deliver 30% on average of what the nameplate is. So you need 3 times that. So that's the problem with this thing. You need to build so much more of this stuff than what the nameplate suggests. And then you need to back it up with all this storage and all this other stuff that it just becomes prohibitively expensive. And then they don't last that long. So then you've got to turn them over every 20 years. Like, this is not environmentally friendly. It uses a ton of land, a ton of resources, and that sort of thing. And ultimately, one of the arguments these net zero heroes always crap on about is they say, oh yeah, but the sun and the wind are free, solar and wind are free. Well, guess what? The rain's free as well. It doesn't make water free, right? It doesn't make our water supplies free, because we've got to harvest that rain. We've got to build all the infrastructure for that rain. We've got to build everything else that goes around it. So in the end, you end up paying a lot more for your water. It's not free. Well, it's a similar thing with this wind and solar. It's not free. Like, yes, the sun shines and that's free, and the wind blows and that's free. But you got to harvest it. And the cost of that harvesting is enormous. The amount of machinery and all the other stuff you need, and transmission, all that stuff to harvest this stuff, is astronomical. And that's why this renewable fantasy is not cheaper. And if we keep going down this road and we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again, we're just going to deliver ourselves more and more expensive power, and we're going to deindustrialize further, and our manufacturing shares is going to continue to shrink. And in the end, the only stuff they're going to be left with is things that are non-tradable. So we'll probably still end up making bricks here, right? Because it's too expensive to import them, because they're too heavy and But guess what? The bricks will go up in cost, and it costs more to build a house, right? Because of high energy. But any sort of manufacturing that can be traded, we're not going to make anymore. We're going to have to import it all. And the only manufacturers that will be left will be this non-tradable stuff, or will be stuff that's relying on government subsidies, right? That's not sustainable for an economy. And unfortunately, the root cause of this is expensive energy. Like Australia's grand bargain was for after the Second World War was we always had high wages, right? But we had cheap energy. And because we had that cheap energy, we could get away with the high wages. We could get by. Well, now we've got, I guess wages haven't grown nearly as much as they should have, but, because we've got a low productivity economy, but we've still got advanced world wages, but now we've got expensive energy. So the economic model does not work for Australia. So the solution is not to keep digging a deeper hole and going down, even doubling down on this net zero stuff and shutting down our reliable baseload power. The solution is to not do that, right? Stop digging a bigger hole. But unfortunately, Martin, here's how I think it's going to play out, right? So we've shut down a whole bunch of coal generators. We're still heavily reliant on those coal generators. They're getting old, and they're being stressed. They're being basically redlined. So if it's like a car, imagine running your engine at full tilt, right? We're redlining our remaining coal generators to get enough power out of them, because you can't rely on this renewable stuff. They're under stress. At some point, we're going to have a Spanish or Portugal-style blackout somewhere. And it'll happen because one of the coal generators will fail. There'll be a cataclysmic failure, and suddenly we'll have blackouts. And Chris Bowen and all the cronies, all the net zero heroes and all the idiots on the new economy, and that will say, see, coal's unreliable. Therefore, we've got to shut down coal. We've got to get off coal. We can't trust coal. We can't rely on coal. What these same Muppets will not mention is that the reason why we're so reliant on this coal in the first place is because we're in the middle of a wind drought. So the wind turbines aren't doing anything, despite having, I think it's 14 gigawatts or something installed across the country, but tons of it. And the solar panels were useless because it wasn't the middle of the day, or we had cloudy conditions or whatever. Those same idiots won't sit there and go, wind and solar failed, and we were too reliant on coal, because they're useless and they don't work most of the time, or half the time, or when they're needed, I should say. They'll instead blame coal, right? Because one of these generators will end up, we've shut down a whole bunch of them where we don't have many left. They're being used at full capacity. They're old, whatever. They'll get blamed for the cataclysmic failure, rather than the renewables, which didn't step up to the plate and didn't deliver like they promised they would. That's what's going to happen. And then they'll use it as an excuse to deride coal even more. They'll use it as a reason to shut down coal, shut down more coal generators. And the reason why we have to double down on renewables, even though renewables were the reason why we had this problem in the first place, because they don't work. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, and just one other little point. I don't know whether people realize, but the marginal price of electricity is actually priced off the most expensive form of generation, right? And
Gas and
guess what?
batteries.
Yeah, guess what?
Gas and batteries. So yes, you're right. So it's done on 5-minute bids.
Yeah.
And so basically, when the bid stack comes in, the highest bid becomes sets the margin price, or the highest one that's used, right? And here's the problem. So, a lot of time these renewable muppets always say, "Oh, look, the wholesale price is zero. It's gone negative during the perfect conditions, middle of the day when the solar's generating and all this sort of stuff, and got wind." Right? They point to the short run marginal cost being negative at a certain point in time. They go, "Oh, look, see, it's the cheapest." Problem with it is most of these renewables don't deliver when the demand is, right. The demand is usually when they're not delivering. So it's not in the middle of the day. It's not 12 o'clock or midday when the demand is, right. So unfortunately, the Australian government is heavily subsidising homes to get more solar panels, and then home batteries as well, etc. Right. Now, the problem with that is that in the evening, when so we get these short periods where the wholesale price is zero, but then we have periods where the demand spikes and the renewables go missing. And then if we shut down the coal generators, they're going to be fully reliant on gas. And this is the problem South Australia's got. So South Australia's got the most expensive energy in the country because transmission, the cost of transmission have gone up heaps because of that to build all this stuff, wind and everything. And B, it's often reliant on gas. So it uses gas all the time as peaking, because often whenever the renewables and the fail, which is regularly, they need gas or they need to burn diesel. So they burn gas and diesel, and they're very expensive, right? So as a result, its average cost is always higher. And it'd be even worse. South Australia would have had heaps of blackouts if it didn't have the interconnector with Victoria, which basically means they can sponge off Victorian brown coal. So the problem we've got is it's set on these sort of marginal bids, and in the middle of the day when it's sunny in the middle of summer or whatever, and we have abundance of solar power, they always go, "Oh, look, see, solar's the cheapest. It's zero power, whereas coal's expensive." Whatever. What they don't mention is that in the evening or whatever, when this renewable stuff doesn't work, and we start drawing on those batteries, battery power charges a huge rate. Like, it's very expensive. Gas is expensive. So when those things are used, the price goes up. And the problem with it is over the journey, the price is a lot higher than it would have been if we just had traditional baseload coal.
Mm.
And the whole thing just doesn't work. And the problem with it is also, another argument they use, they say, "Oh, there isn't a commercial coal-fired power plant. No one would build a coal-fired power plant now because it's unprofitable." Well, the reason why it's unprofitable is because if you're a traditional baseload generator, you're constantly being asked to turn off and on, because the way our system's set up with renewable energy certificates and all the other stuff is we have to use the renewables first. So the middle of the day when the sun's out, the coal generators would ever have to wind down or shut down because the sun. So that means they're not used at full capacity, which means their average costs are higher. So their costs are spread out. They can't spread their costs, and they can't make as much money because they have to continually shut down and then refire back up. But they're only shutting down and refiring back up because the renewables work intermittently, and that makes coal unprofitable. But you still need that coal because the renewables don't work most of the time, or a lot of the time. So we basically have to run these dual systems where we have to have all this renewable stuff. We've got to pay for that and all the transmission. It often doesn't work, so then we need to back it up with gas, which sits idle a lot of the time, but then needs to be used, sporadically to cover for the renewables. And then we've got to have coal generators sitting there idle, but then also available to be used when the renewables fail. So we end up having all this stuff that you wouldn't need if you just had 24/7 baseload and then, mixed in with a bit of peaking. So you end up with just way more stuff in the system that has to be paid for. Even when it's not being used, it's got to be paid for. So you end up with just much higher electricity bills overall. And that's effectively the problem Australia's got. And it's not just us, it's elsewhere. So unfortunately, adding all this intermittency into the system and all the, batteries and all the other stuff that's got to be built, it's just added a ton of cost. And again, it doesn't match supply with demand. It delivers energy when you don't need it. You can't control you don't know when it's going to deliver the energy because it's dependent on the weather. So you can't plan around it. So you need all this backup stuff, which then you've got to pay for even when it's not being used. So you end up with this much more expensive system, and it ends up that, if you're a traditional baseload generator, it's harder to make a profit because you can't run it 24/7. So the whole system just is rigged for expense and rigged for waste and rigged for being idleness, spare capacity. So this is the system we've got, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And just to round that out, because we're running out of time now, what that means is that those higher marginal prices flow back to very high profits to the energy generators that are actually generating at lower cost, right? So what that means is that some of those renewables are receiving super profits on the energy that they're generating, which is also another remarkable factor too. So that's one of the reasons why there's still quite a strong interest from some to actually build more of the renewable stuff. But if you look at the profit flows, consumers are actually paying more than they should because of the marginal pricing mechanisms that we've touched on. So this is an absolute mess. And the problem, of course, it's not just Australia, it's the UK and other places too. And the energy conundrum here is at the base of trying to work out how to actually drive the economy forward. But look, as we come to the end, Leith, I don't know what you think, but to my mind, our politicians have really done us no great service at all. The point is there are levers that could be pulled, whether it's the migration lever or whether it's the energy, alternative strategy lever. There are things that could be done, but there is no intent from the politicians to do those things, which means we end up with a narrow economic base. We end up with a housing story that is actually ever more expensive, and we have an economy that's going backwards, and that can't be good for the future.
No, and unfortunately, I think they're going to double down on everything that's going to make the situation worse. You're going to get more, big Australia's just locked in. It's not going to change. This net zero delusion, they're going to double down on it. Despite the fact I didn't mention, I won't go on it quickly, but it looks like New Zealand's actually banned net zero. So interestingly, across the pond, they've effectively banned net zero. They want to go back to burning their own coal, etc. Good on them. But we're not going down that road. And obviously, on the housing side, they just want to blow a bigger bubble. All the policies that have been announced are designed to increase mortgage debt and increase, house prices and to pump the housing bubble even bigger. So I'm not very positive about the future of this country, unfortunately. I think we've got an existential threat. Unfortunately, I wish it wasn't that case, but I just can't see. I think we're honestly on the road to Argentina. Whether we get there and how long it takes, I don't know. But I just think we are going to plunge down the developed country rankings, and we're just going to become a less diversified, less serious country that is going to become poorer, ultimately poorer, and have a lot more problems left, right, and center. It's just I'm not very hopeful, unfortunately, and I would love to be more positive, but the way I see it on this energy stuff, on the immigration stuff, on the housing stuff, I just can't see any that much hope in our political system doing what needs to be done and turning things around, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately, that's right. The lucky country may be running out of luck, but it's almost by design because the politicians are actually making decisions for reasons other than the obvious ones that we might think they're making them. And unfortunately, some of those decisions are turning out to be very bad decisions. And we've seen that for, unfortunately, now quite a long period of time, and it's not necessarily going to change. Leith, I want to say thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and charts again, as always. Greatly appreciated. Always have a great conversation when you come on. If people want to know more about you and what you do, where do they go?
Yeah, so number one, go to macrobusiness.com.au. That's where I, write all my articles, etc. We've actually got Tarek Brooker on board now. He's joined the team, which is great. Tarek's a legend. I think everyone knows. Everyone's familiar with Tarek, so he's now joined Macrobusiness. He's doing other stuff as well, but he's joined us, which is fantastic. Also, I've got a YouTube channel, which is at Leith Vo. I should probably change that at some point, but at Leithvo. That's just basically where I post all my interviews. So if I do, do my radio interviews, etc., other podcasts, whatever, I put them up there, and that's basically if you want to follow all my various interviews on TV and radio and whatever, you can watch them there. Often cover these sorts of issues, but not usually in this much depth.
No, and the beauty of this particular channel is we can go into considerably more depth than otherwise, because you get the smaller interviews where you can, and you do that really, really well. But the point, I think, of this channel is trying to get into a deeper amount of analysis and trying to understand what's going on, join the dots, which I think is pretty important. Tarek came on last Friday and we had a very good conversation about some of these issues too. And what we're trying to do here is just to raise the bar in terms of helping people to understand, because step one is to understand what's going on. Step two is to then decide how we can make some changes to do things better. And that, of course, is what we ultimately get to. Leith, I want to say thank you very much as always. I'll look forward to having you back on down the track. We'll figure out the next date. I look forward to that. And just to tell you before we go, I did ask the question about the question in the poll, which was, as high migration drives home prices, higher government should, 1, cut migration to match home supply. 88% said yes, well, that's good. No, migration makes no difference. 3% said that. Change migration to target builders. 7% said that. And increase migration to boost GDP. Only 2% said that. So we didn't have many from Treasury in the chat tonight, Leith.
That's always good to hear. Look, personally, I think number 1 and number 3 would be the way to go. Cut migration to match supply, but also I think we do need some. We should skew it a bit more towards builders rather than Uber drivers and a whole bunch of stuff we don't need, which unfortunately is the majority of the migration system.
Yeah, there was a lot of people talking about, different career paths. And I keep coming back to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Do you remember that, when they were classic. Shunting off with the people onto that other planet they didn't want anymore, the marketing executives and those sort of things? Well, they've got the same issue. Leith, I want to say thank you very much. And I'll look forward to having you back on again. I'll take you offline now, and I'm going to close the show. Thank you.
Cheers. See you, Ron. See you, Ron.
And there we are. I want to say, Jason, thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciated that. Thank you, as always. It really helps to defray some of the expenses here. And just to tell you that next week, Adam Stokes is on. We're going to talk crypto and what's happening there with regards to Trump, the US, crypto markets more broadly, and the debasing of the fiat currencies, all those things. So that should be an interesting conversation. The dogs are sort of here. They're not posing very well tonight. There you go. But at least you can see that there's a bit of Meteor and there's most of Luna as well. So they're there. They did make one bark at one point, but hopefully it wasn't too distracting. Anyway, thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Have a good evening, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Of course, we put out the recorded shows each of the day of the week as well, so check those out. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for Super Chats. Thank you for all your comments and questions. Didn't get to them all, but hope you found that an interesting conversation this evening. So wish you the best. Have a good week, and I'll see you next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Cheerio. Take care.